The exotic blend of a classic flying boat and brand new jet engines gave birth to a truly unique aircraft, the SR.A. Imagine a diamond-shaped island of chalk and sandstone measuring 23 by 13 miles, surrounded by the waters of the Solent. To different people, this island means completely different things. For everyday tourists, it is those little glass souvenir bottles filled with colored sand they bring back from vacation. For hardcore sailors, it is an absolute mecca in early August. Victorian-era buffs come here to take in the historic architecture of Ventnor. And former inmates of the infamous local Parkhurst prison? They probably just want to forget the place forever. Younger aviation enthusiasts will likely point out that this is where the short but incredibly eventful history of Britain-Norman got its start. But for the classic aviation crowd, the guys with a little gray in their hair and a classic tweed jacket still hanging in the closet, the Isle of Wight means just one thing: Saunders-Roe, or simply SR.A. In the aviation world, the name SR.A. is as synonymous with flying boats as Aston Martin is with high-end sports cars. And that makes perfect sense when you consider the company roots. They go all the way back to the 1830s, when the Saunders family was in the traditional shipbuilding business. Eventually, the founder's grandson, Sam Saunders, started his own outfit, the Samuel Edgar Saunders Company. During World War I, he decided to branch out by becoming a subcontractor for the aviation industry. In the years following the armistice, business was pretty hit or miss. The company picked up various commercial contracts and went through a few financial mergers. However, its aviation division was stuck in a steady decline. Everything changed in 1928 when the legendary aviation pioneer Elliott Verdon Roe parted ways with the company he had founded with his brother. By that point, he was absolutely obsessed with the idea of building flying boats, and he wanted nothing more than to manufacture them himself. Elliott Verdon Roe looked at the Samuel Edgar Saunders operation and saw the perfect setup to make his dream a reality. He brought in some much-needed cash and bought a controlling stake. And just like that, the newly rebranded Saunders-Roe was born. A fresh board of directors was put together, bringing in some of Elliott's old colleagues. Meanwhile, Sam Saunders took on the honorary role of president. The chief designer job went to Henry Noller, an engineer already well known across the industry for his outstanding talent. That was the new dynamic at the company as it went on to develop famous models like the Cloud, the London, and the A-37 Shrimp. But when World War II broke out, British industry had to throw everything it had into building Spitfire fighters. This left the company's aviation division in a pretty tough spot. At the time, they were mass-producing the Walrus aircraft and were just getting the prototype of its successor, the Sea Otter, ready for its first flight. The Ministry of Aircraft Production looked at Saunders-Roe with its extensive background in naval aviation and saw the perfect candidate to take over the development and full-scale production of both amphibious aircraft. Because the company's main plant along the River Medina was highly vulnerable to enemy attacks, production had to be decentralized. They set up dispersed shadow factories over in Weybridge and out on the Isle of Anglesey. The company worked hard to conceal its manufacturing facilities in all sorts of low-profile locations, scattering them right across the Isle of Wight itself. In the winter of 1943, Sir Arthur Gouge left Short Brothers and joined Saunders-Roe as vice chairman. It was through his vision and support that the company turned its attention to jet engines. Their massive power output and the lack of bulky propellers seemed like the perfect solution for creating a revolutionary single-seat flying boat fighter. This ambitious project had a main selling point. It offered the ability to operate from sheltered coastal areas and inland waterways. It was soon pitched to the government. There is a theory that SR.A. designed this new project specifically for combat operations in the Pacific Theater, but that claim is highly questionable. In reality, the engineers at the company were not even focused on that theater initially. Furthermore, the fuel capacity of the aircraft gave it a very specific range, completely ruling out sustained operations across distant ocean islands, although you cannot dismiss one possibility. With further development, the fighter could have been adapted for those kinds of missions. Later on, the Ministry of Aircraft Production requested a series of significant changes to the initial design. To bring these ideas to life, SR.A. was tasked with building 3 experimental prototypes of the new aircraft. Under strict orders from the ministry, they needed to keep the footprint of the fighter as compact as possible. On top of that, the aircraft was intended to operate at specific altitudes, which eliminated the need for a complex pressurized cockpit, making the design significantly lighter and simpler. Back in 1943 and 1944, there were clear leaders in British jet engine development, Rolls-Royce and de Havilland. At the time, they were heavily focused on centrifugal flow designs. Meanwhile, Metropolitan Vickers, or Metrovick for short, went down a completely different path. Right from the start, they went all in on axial flow turbojets. The engineers clearly understood the benefits. The smaller frontal area allowed for sleeker, more aerodynamic designs. Their engine, designated the F2, went through its first bench tests in 1941. Just a year later, it was cleared for full-scale flight testing. The F2 took to the air for the first time on June 29, 1943. To make this happen, it was mounted in the tail section of a modified Lancaster heavy bomber. Integrating the jet engine required serious modifications to the fuselage of the bomber. A massive air intake was added to the dorsal spine, and a long exhaust pipe replaced the rear turret, extending a full 7 feet out the back. Alongside the Lancaster testbed, they also tested the new F2 engines on early jet fighter prototypes. But the program had its issues. The thrust at idle was too high, so the engines had to be sent back to the Metrovick plant for a major overhaul. Once engineers ironed out these flaws and reinstalled the updated engines, the prototype successfully took to the skies. This historic flight took place on November 13, 1943, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. Eventually, the F2 was integrated into the airframe of the famous British Meteor fighter. This specific variant of the aircraft was known as the Meteor Mark IV. It was equipped with a pair of these engines, which were later renamed the Beryl. This unique fighter was proudly shown off to the public at a major exhibition held by the Society of British Aircraft Constructors. Eventually, the original Lancaster testbed reached the end of its airframe life and had to be permanently grounded. So flight testing for these advanced engines was transferred to another Lancaster. The setup remained the same, with the engine mounted in the rear fuselage and tested with jet pipes of varying lengths to find the optimal configuration. Testing wrapped up successfully in 1945, resulting in a highly refined engine officially named the Beryl. Returning to Saunders-Roe, the reliable and powerful Beryl was chosen as the power plant for their new flying boat. Originally designated the SR-44, the aircraft was later renamed under a new system, becoming the legendary SR.A. The main advantage of the Metrovick engines was their narrow overall diameter, allowing engineers to mount two engines side by side inside the hull. This brilliant solution kept the airframe narrow and streamlined while leaving plenty of room inside for maintenance. To feed both engines the massive volume of air they needed, a large elliptical intake was positioned in the nose, well clear of the waterline. Since it was a flying boat, there was a real risk of water ingestion from spray when the stabilizing floats were extended. To prevent this, designers came up with a unique system. An extension nozzle would deploy outward by 10 inches when the floats were lowered, acting as a spray deflector. In practice, though, this whole complex setup turned out to be totally unnecessary. The extendable intake was only fitted to the third prototype and was quickly dropped when testing showed the aircraft handled the spray perfectly fine without it. By early 1946, component production for the three prototypes was in full swing. Things were moving fast at the Beaumaris factory. Assembly of the first airframe was a solid 8 months ahead of the second, with the third lagging 4 months behind that. The new flying boat featured all-metal construction. The only design element that really sparked heated debate among the engineering team was the hull itself. Chief designer Henry Knoller initially proposed giving it an unusually narrow and shallow planing bottom, theorizing it would minimize aerodynamic drag in flight and hydrodynamic drag on the water. However, theoretical calculations quickly revealed a major flaw. Compared to a conventional hull design, this radical shape would severely compromise the aircraft's longitudinal stability on the water. Therefore, the bold idea had to be permanently scrapped. To help the heavy aircraft maneuver on the water at low taxi speeds, a steerable water rudder was installed at the rear of the hull. Located just forward of the main flight rudder, it provided excellent directional control during the initial stages of the takeoff run. The pilot could control this water rudder directly from the cockpit. As the aircraft broke contact with the water and transitioned into flight, the mechanism locked securely into a neutral position to avoid adding any aerodynamic drag. The tail section of the hull had an interesting layout, sweeping sharply upward from the waterline. This design kept the empennage well clear of the waves and formed a massive, broad vertical fin and rudder. The engineers mid-mounted the horizontal stabilizer exactly halfway up the fin. Thanks to this cruciform layout, the tailplane was safely kept out of the path of the hot jet exhaust and heavy water spray during takeoff and landing. The projected combat potential of the aircraft was impressive. It was designed to carry 4 20mm Hispano cannons tightly packed into the nose, just above the oval air intake. 2 were mounted centrally on top, while the other 2 were positioned slightly lower on the sides. Additionally, hardpoints under the wings allowed it to carry bombs or rockets. However, since these were strictly test airframes, neither the cannons nor the combat payloads were ever actually fitted to any of the prototypes. The cockpit featured a bulged, 3-piece clear canopy providing excellent all-around visibility. But what is most interesting is the connection of this aircraft to a major breakthrough in aviation history. The first prototype, wearing tail number TG263, became one of the first aircraft ever to be fitted with an early ejection seat, newly developed by the legendary Martin Baker Company. Engineers tucked the jet engines deep inside the hull, mounting them directly under the high wing. The exhaust nozzles exited on both sides of the rear fuselage, just aft of the wing's trailing edge. To optimize thrust, the jet pipes were angled slightly downward and splayed outward at a 5-degree angle. The fuel system consisted of 4 tanks, 2 in each wing root. Their total capacity was 425 imperial gallons, roughly 510 U.S. gallons of jet fuel, giving the fighter a solid operational range. The retraction mechanism for the stabilizing outboard floats also deserves a mention. In flight, the struts would swing inward through a 90-degree arc, while the floats themselves rotated 180 degrees. Thanks to this clever geometry, the lower half of the float tucked cleanly into the wing structure, sitting perfectly flush with the lower wing skin and virtually eliminating drag. In the spring of 1947, the main components of the first TG263 prototype were moved to Cowes for final assembly. However, that is when politics began to interfere with the ambitious project. SR.A.'s management started receiving unofficial hints from government officials. With the war in the Pacific over, a jet-powered flying boat fighter had lost its main strategic purpose, meaning the order for the third prototype might be canceled. SR.A.'s response was firm. Production on all 3 airframes was already too far along, and canceling the order made no financial sense. While true, there was another reason for their stance. Aside from the SR.A. one, the company had practically no other major projects at the time, and management refused to lay off their highly skilled workforce. On top of that, SR.A. was highly optimistic about winning the contract to build the massive Princess flying boat, and losing their best technicians right before landing that contract would have been disastrous. The Ministry of Supply ultimately conceded that the fighters were in their final stages of construction, reluctantly allowing the work to continue. Finally, in July 1947, the first prototype, TG263, made its grand debut. It was a truly massive aircraft, 50 feet long with a 46-foot wingspan, weighing in at a substantial 16,000 pounds. For a fighter of that era, those dimensions were absolutely huge. For comparison, a popular jet fighter of the time, the Meteor Mark IV, weighed just 14,460 pounds fully loaded. But this heavy flying boat was powered by 2 mighty Metrovick Beryl MVB-1 turbojets, each producing 3,250 pounds of static thrust at sea level. This guaranteed excellent flight performance, especially at high altitudes. To keep the aerodynamics as clean as possible, the airplane's entire outer surface received a thin layer of special Titanine silver paint, cutting drag down to an absolute minimum. Shortly after World War II, experienced pilot Jeffrey Tyson joined SR.A. as their chief test pilot, a role he held right up until retiring in 1956. Before moving to Cowes, Tyson worked as a test pilot for the legendary Short brothers. While there, he was heavily involved in complex mid-air refueling experiments for their large C-class flying boats, specifically the Short Empire. On July 16, 1947, Tyson began water taxi testing the first prototype of the innovative SR.A. jet seaplane. While taxiing, he felt so confident in the aircraft that he decided not to wait, taking it up for its maiden flight that very same evening. After touching down, Tyson was extremely pleased with the results, specifically noting the aircraft's surprisingly short takeoff run. His only minor complaint was a moderate yaw, a slight tendency to wander off course while on the water. Over the next few days, the team carried out a series of additional test flights. During this time, engineers noticed some buffeting where the vertical fin and horizontal stabilizer met, quickly solving it by installing a small acorn-shaped fairing. Also during these initial tests, the airplane showed a slight tendency to roll uncommanded, almost as if it wanted to do a barrel roll. They fixed this with a minor adjustment to the rudder linkage. The pilots also found a way to shorten the takeoff run even further. To cut down on drag, they started retracting the underwing stabilizing floats the moment the aircraft gained enough speed on the water. It is worth noting that the SR.A. was a highly unusual and radical design, completely different from the conventional fighters of its day. On top of that, its Metrovick Beryl turbojets had only gone through basic flight testing on a flying testbed, a modified Meteor Mark IV. Despite all this, the test flights went incredibly smoothly and without any major snags. It later became clear that there simply was not a real combat role for such a highly specialized seaplane. But that does not take away from the success of the engineers and pilots who tested this next-generation technology. Ultimately, though, a constant lack of funding placed strict limits on any further development of the program. In April 1948, the second prototype of this unique aircraft took to the water on the River Maiden. All the technical upgrades, like the modified rudder and the acorn fairing tested on the first prototype, were incorporated into this second model right on the assembly line. Because of this, externally it looked identical to both its predecessor and the prototype that followed it. The main difference was under the skin. The second prototype was powered by new, more capable Metropolitan Vickers MVB-2 engines, each producing 250 pounds more thrust than the first-generation MVB-1. On the last day of the month, this upgraded flying boat completed a successful maiden flight, officially joining the flight test program. Back in the early days of the Second World War, the British Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment had to be evacuated from Felixstowe, moving to a safer location at Helensburgh on the River Clyde. Once the war ended, the team slowly started making their way back to their home base in Suffolk. By the summer of 1948, they were fully operational again. Right around this time, factory tests on the second SR.A. prototype wrapped up successfully, and the aircraft was handed over to naval aviation experts for evaluation. But testing did not always go smoothly. A month after the second prototype took to the skies, the first aircraft suffered a major in-flight emergency when its clear cockpit canopy completely tore off in mid-air. Instead of manufacturing a whole new glass canopy, the crew temporarily fitted the aircraft with a metal fairing featuring a small observation window. As is so often the case, the temporary fix became permanent, staying on the aircraft until the very end of its service life. On August 17, 1948, the third and final prototype of the SR.A. flying boat made its first flight. Its Metropolitan Vickers power plant got another significant bump in performance, with sea-level static thrust for each of the new Beryl engines now standing at an impressive 3,850 pounds. On this third aircraft, the engineers introduced an interesting technical solution. They linked the retraction mechanism for the outrigger floats to the operation of the extendable air intake, and this same system controlled aerodynamic dive brakes on the underside of the wing. Interestingly, these dive brakes were actually installed on all three prototypes, but on the first two, they were bolted shut for safety reasons. Aside from the engines and automation, the third aircraft also featured a few aerodynamic tweaks. Specifically, the planing bottoms on its outrigger floats were set a bit higher compared to the earlier models. As a result, designers had to fit deeper, bulkier fairings on the trailing edge of the wing to maintain smooth aerodynamic lines and avoid degrading flight characteristics. Remember, the flying boat's internal fuel capacity was relatively small. 4 fuel tanks buried deep inside the wings held a combined total of just 425 imperial gallons of fuel. To extend its range, the third prototype was temporarily fitted with external drop tanks, mounted flush against the underside of each wing to minimize drag. However, it is still a bit of a mystery whether these tanks were ever actually plumbed for fuel or if they were just fitted purely to test the aerodynamics of the updated airframe. Another interesting experiment on the TG-271 prototype involved its exhaust nozzles. They were fitted with special pen nib fairings, very similar to those used on the Hawker P-1052 fighter. It is not exactly clear how long the aircraft flew with this modification, but since this specific airframe flew plenty of engine test sorties, it is safe to assume these unusual fairings were a key part of a broader testing program. Just 3 weeks after its maiden flight, test pilot Jeffrey Tyson took this third SR.A. prototype to Farnborough, debuting the jet at the massive airshow with a brilliant aerobatic display. His routine even included sustained inverted flight. To make this happen, engineers installed a special valve to maintain a steady flow of jet fuel while upside down. However, the inverted tank held just 18 imperial gallons, roughly 22 US gallons. This was barely enough for exactly one spectacular pass per flight. 1949 would be the defining and, sadly, the final chapter for the SR.A. project. In August, legendary test pilot Eric Brown was invited to personally test the TG-271 prototype. At the controls, Brown immediately noted how surprisingly maneuverable the flying boat was on the water. But he also discovered a major flaw. As the aircraft pitched up at speeds between 20 and 30 miles per hour, the pilot lost almost all forward visibility. As it continued to accelerate, the jet planed out and leveled off, smoothly lifting off the water after just 18 seconds. During dive tests, the prototype accelerated to an impressive 550 miles per hour, and the air brakes proved highly effective at quickly bleeding off airspeed. When it was time to head back, air traffic control radioed that the wind had shifted, leaving the water surface almost glass smooth. Brown began his approach, coming in over the water at 110 miles per hour and touched down softly. But right at that critical moment, to his horror, he spotted a massive submerged log directly in his path. The TG-271 prototype smashed into the obstacle with a deafening crack. A chunk of wood violently kicked up from under the hull and struck the right wing float, tearing it clean off. Lacking support, the right wing immediately dropped, dug into the water, and the heavy jet flipped over violently, dragging across the surface before finally coming to a stop. Freezing water immediately began flooding the cockpit. The disoriented pilot managed to unbuckle his harness and ditch his parachute, but realized he was trapped beneath the broken wing structure. Meanwhile, a rescue launch was already racing toward the crash site. Every second counted. Fellow test pilot Jeffrey Tyson dove into the water fully clothed to save his colleague. Fortunately, both aviators were safely pulled aboard. The TG-271 airframe could not be saved, however. It quickly sank to the bottom, and no trace of it was ever found. Eyewitnesses who watched it go down reported seeing 2 large holes in the forward section of the hull. Despite the terrifying, near-fatal crash, Eric Brown's opinion of the aircraft remained unchanged. He continued to maintain that the flying boat was incredibly pleasant and responsive to fly, calling it an absolutely unique aircraft with unexpectedly good handling characteristics. The project's streak of bad luck continued the very next month. The second prototype, TG-267, was lost at another airbase. That day, squadron leader Kenneth Edward Major was practicing a flight demonstration for an upcoming airshow celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Britain. The weather was terrible, and the flight ended in tragedy. For unknown reasons, the prototype suddenly entered a steep dive, slamming into the North Sea at high speed and taking the pilot down with it. Recovery teams later managed to dredge up the wreckage, but even a thorough investigation could not determine exactly what went wrong. Even though investigators concluded that the aircraft's design was not at fault, these 2 back-to-back losses were the final nail in the coffin. Shortly after, the innovative SR.A. development program was permanently canceled. Following World War II, the global aviation industry rapidly contracted. As a result, Metropolitan Vickers decided to return to their pre-war business of manufacturing electrical generators, handing the Beryl jet engine project and their other turbojet programs over to Armstrong Siddeley. The original order for 11 of these engines for the 3 SR.A. prototypes plus spares was not canceled. However, the project's new owners made it perfectly clear they had no intention of mass-producing the Beryl. This was entirely expected, as their own Sapphire engines, later built under license in the US as the J-65, looked a lot more promising. So even if the developers had managed to land a major production order for their fighter, they would have faced a serious engine shortage. Vague proposals to swap in the new Sapphires quickly fell apart. As soon as the massive cost of redesigning the flying boat's hull was factored in, the idea sank to the bottom just as fast as the earlier prototype. The sole surviving prototype sat in storage until November 1950. However, when the Korean War broke out, the military's interest in the jet-powered flying boat concept was reignited. The aircraft was quickly pulled out of mothballs for a new series of water trials. But the power plant issue remained. Engineers concluded that redesigning the hull for new engines would simply take too much time. Plus, there was no guarantee the redesign would even be successful. The following year, the experimental aircraft was prepped for the massive Festival of Britain. Renowned test pilot Geoffrey Tyson performed a spectacular flight demonstration over the Woolwich Reach on the River Thames. Afterward, the flying boat was simply towed up the river to London's South Bank for public display. Once the exhibitions wrapped up, the unique aircraft was transferred to the College of Aeronautics at Cranfield for study. While at the college, one of the Beryl turbojets was removed from the airframe and repurposed to power a record-setting hydroplane named Bluebird. Piloting this boat, the famous racer Donald Campbell sought to break the world water speed record. Tragically, that story also ended in disaster. The engine once again found its way to the bottom of a different body of water following Campbell's fatal crash. In 1966, the long-suffering flying boat was transferred to the Skyfame Aviation Museum in Staverton, near Cheltenham. 12 years later, the aircraft made its final move, becoming a centerpiece of the collection at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, where it finally found its permanent home. The museum staff stripped away all the later civilian markings, restoring the SR.A. prototype to its original appearance from the days of its early military trials. Today, it sits on display as an absolutely unique aircraft. It is the one and only representative of the jet-powered flying boat fighter class, a category that consists entirely of this single airframe. While it may not have been a commercial success, it was definitely a unique gem. For a lot of aviation enthusiasts, one of the absolute crown jewels in the entire history of British aviation was Geoffrey Tyson's thunderous flying display at the 1948 Farnborough Air Show. That is when the legendary test pilot tore down the main runway at an altitude of just 100 feet, and he did it completely inverted. Keeping the aircraft on its back, he climbed away toward Laffon's plane, gradually disappearing over the horizon and leaving the crowd in absolute awe of the spectacle they had just witnessed.